strengthen, not weaken Section 5, as it still serves as a very real and critical purpose in preserving our democracy and the right to vote for millions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Payne, Jr. We appreciate your remarks. I now yield to the distinguished member from Maryland, Representative Cummings, who is the ranking member on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, the committee that has jurisdiction on voting reform issues, for as much time as the distinguished member requires.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I also take this moment to thank the Congressional Black Caucus for making this happen, and I thank Representatives Horsford and Jeffries for leading this. It is quite encouraging, and I know that our chairman, Marsha Fudge, agrees with me when we see our new members come to the forefront and lead. That's why our constituents sent us here, and I just want you to know that we are very, very, very proud of you, as we are our other new member, Mr. Payne, who just spoke, and we are certainly glad that you are here and leading. You know, we all know our nation's disgraceful history in this area of voting rights. I've often said that if we did not have the Voting Rights Act, this past few years have taught us that we'd have to invent it. For decades and decades, racist and exclusionary voting practices kept minorities from accessing the ballot box. I'm reminded of my great-great-grandfather, Mr. Scipio Rain. In the South Carolina of 1868, he overcame tremendous hardships and life-threatening dangers just to register to vote, only a few years after he had come out of slavery. Sadly, this country has witnessed very slow progress toward equality in voting. The reality is that in the year 2013, we're still fighting for the right to vote for all Americans. In election after election, discriminatory voting laws and exclusionary practices still surface. This past election cycle, we saw a new wave of efforts to suppress the vote. We saw racially motivated efforts to cut back on early voting. We saw physical destruction of voter registration forms. Across the country, we saw eligible voters prevented from casting their ballots because of long lines, inaccurate voter records, and poorly trained poll workers. As a ranking member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, I launched an investigation last year into the actions of True the Vote, a Tea Party organization that claims to promote, quote, voter integrity efforts. In fact, True the Vote sought to make it harder for Americans to vote. They challenged the registration of thousands of legitimate voters across the country before Election Day. And they deployed volunteers across the country to challenge access to the polls for legitimate voters. Efforts by groups like True the Vote disproportionately affect minority communities, and they are just one small example of the practices that still seek to suppress the vote in our country. The Voting Rights Act is often cited as the most effective civil rights law in our history. Section 5 has been one of the most powerful tools in the Act because it combats discriminatory attempts to marginalize voters before they can take root. When President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, he said this, and I quote, "There were those who said smaller and more gradual measures should be tried, but they had been tried. For years and years they had been tried and tried and tried, and they had failed and failed and failed. And the time for failure is gone," end of quote. And so, in closing, I hope the Supreme Court justices remember these words as they consider this most recent challenge to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Today, in the year of 2013, Section 5 remains as critical as ever to protecting the right to vote in the United States of America. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cummings. And I know under your leadership as the ranking member of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, the issue of voting rights will continue to be a top priority in this Congress.
You're absolutely right. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, I now yield to the distinguished member from Maryland, our whip, Mr. Hoyer.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Steve and I are both in the Senate, and you have a president in the Senate, and that's why he was referring to you as Mr. President. I understand that, Steve. I am pleased to join Marcia Fudge, Chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, and my good friend Steve Horsford, gentleman from Nevada, and I noticed that Don Payne is here. His father was a very close friend of mine, active some 45 years ago. So it was good to see you here, Don. And Hakeem Jeffries, two of our really great new members. Pleased to join you. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus for organizing this special order. America's greatest strength and its greatest gift to the world is our democratic system of government based on an equal voice for every citizen. It is what grants legitimacy to our laws and earns us respect from those in other parts of the world who yearn for the freedoms we enjoy. For most of our history, our democracy was deeply flawed, excluding women, African Americans, Native Americans, and many others. But part of what makes America great is that we are constantly working to perfect our democracy by correcting such flaws. The Voting Rights of 1965 was a central part of that effort and an incredibly successful one. Before that legislation was enacted, millions of African Americans were systematically prevented from registering to vote or casting their ballots across much of the South. And I would venture to say that there were other parts of America where they were dissuaded from voting as well. Poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and other nefarious devices were employed to keep Americans from exercising their most fundamental civil right. Perhaps the greatest impetus for enacting the Voting Rights Act was the horrific violence and hatred of Bloody Sunday, when peaceful civil rights marchers were beaten and turned back at the Edmund Pettus Bridge outside Selma, Alabama. Mr. Speaker, this weekend, a number of us here will be traveling to Selma, led by the same man who helped organize those 1965 marches, our friend and colleague, John Lewis, an extraordinary historic figure, an extraordinary gentle man, but a giant of courage and principle. We are going as part of an annual pilgrimage to remember that day, Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, and the cause for which those brave Americans, black and white, risked their lives, political equality, and the perfection of our democracy. Mr. Speaker, I've been privileged to walk with John Lewis across that bridge and others, including at least 2 presidents, for 10 out of the 13 times that John Lewis has reenacted that walk. Walking in their footsteps is one way to honor that cause, but it is far from the best way. The best way to do it is to carry on their work, to defend and promote the protections included in the Voting Rights Acts that they fought so hard to bring about. On Wednesday, Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court will hear arguments in Shelby County versus Holder, which challenges the constitutionality of one of the Voting Rights Act's central provisions, and that is preclearance. making sure that the Justice Department says, yes, this is fair. Yes, this will not exclude. Yes, this is a policy that will be consistent with our democracy. Preclearance, established by Section 5 of the Act, mandates that jurisdictions with a long history of voter suppression and civil rights violations must submit to the Justice Department for approval any plans to change their election practices or district boundaries before doing so. Section 5 has been instrumental in ending discrimination and protecting eligible voters at the polls. The constitutionality is rooted in Article 1 and has been working as intended for nearly half a century. At a time when we are hearing about problems voters faced all over the country in last November's election, with long lines, registration errors, voting machines that malfunction, and deceptive practices, we ought to be working together to make the Voting Rights Act stronger, not weaker. I will continue, along with my colleagues, to stand up for the Voting Rights Act on this floor and in every forum of debate, because those who marched at Selma or braved the dangers of the freedom rides did not do so in vain. Their legacy is our responsibility. The more perfect democracy they helped forge is ours to safeguard, not only for our sake, but for the sake of those who will inherit our democracy in generations to come. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to join my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus in strong support of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and the rest of it as well, as it faces meritless challenges this week that I am confident will be surmounted. And again, in closing my part of this special order, I want to congratulate Steve Horsford, Congressman Horsford from Nevada. He's new to this body, but he's not new to legislative representation. He understands the legislative process very, very well, and it is appropriate that in one of his first special orders on this floor that it's on behalf of every American, not just black Americans, not just Hispanic Americans, not just disabled Americans, every American. Because if one American's right to vote is compromised, there will be a risk to all Americans that their vote will be compromised. And I thank my friend, Mr. Congressman Horsford, and yield him back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Hoyer. As our whip, you have provided a strong and articulate voice on these and other issues, and we look forward to continuing to work with you as we move our country forward and protect the most fundamental of all rights, the right to vote. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I now yield to my co-anchor, my colleague as a freshman member in this 113th Congress. I am pleased to be working with him as one of the co-anchors for the Congressional Black Caucus and bringing these important issues to all of our constituents throughout this great country. The distinguished member from New York, Representative Hakeem Jeffries, at this time, as much time as he allows.
Well, let me first just thank the distinguished gentleman from the Silver State, my good friend and colleague, Representative Stephen Horsford, for anchoring the CBC special order. I also, of course, want to thank Chairwoman Marcia Fudge for the tremendous leadership that she has continued to provide, and, of course, to our whip, Steny Hoyer, for his eloquence and his leadership on this and many other issues on behalf of this great country of ours. It's my honor and my privilege to co-anchor this CBC special order, this hour of power, so to speak, where members of the Congressional Black Caucus have an opportunity to speak directly to the American people today on an issue of great importance as it relates to the integrity of our democracy. Perhaps there's no more fundamental issue to preserving the integrity of the great democracy that we have here in America than the right to vote. The right to vote is something that should be cherished, something that should be protected, something that should be respected. But the right to vote has not always been treated in this fashion, in this republic of ours. During the founding of this country, we know, of course, that African Americans were largely excluded from being able to participate in our democracy as a result of the conditions of their enslavement. In 1869, this Congress came together and sent to the states for ratification the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, an amendment that was designed to remedy the situation related to the failure to meaningfully include African Americans in our democracy. It was designed to provide constitutional protection, to limit the ability of states to disenfranchise individuals on the basis of race, color, or prior conditions of servitude. Yet we understand that for about 100 years subsequent to the passage and ratification of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution, it was largely evaded in many parts of America as a result of legislative schemes that were devised to prohibit or limit the ability of African Americans and other communities of color to participate in our democracy. These legislative schemes took many forms. Some have already called the names: poll taxes and grandfather clauses and literacy tests. Legislative schemes devised to limit the ability of African Americans and others to participate in this glorious democracy of ours. A large part of it took place in the Deep South, but there were instances of this all over America. And, Mr. Speaker, that is why the Congress came back in the midst of the turbulent era of the 1960s and passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which included a Section 5 pre-clearance provision that was designed to require those covered jurisdiction or jurisdictions, all or parts of 16 states, to get approval from either the Department of Justice or a 3-judge federal court panel here in Washington, D.C., whenever any of these jurisdictions sought to change a law with respect to voting. The rationale for this Section 5 pre-clearance requirement was because in these covered jurisdictions there was a history of discrimination as it related to the franchise. Deliberate schemes designed to limit the ability of American citizens to participate in our democracy, and as a result of this history, the Section 5 pre-clearance requirement was put into place. And it has worked. Over the close to 5 decades that it has been in effect. It is perhaps the most successful piece of civil rights legislation that this Congress has passed. Now, as a result of its success, there are some who have contended that it is no longer a relevant provision of law, and that when the Congress came together in bipartisan fashion in 2006 to reauthorize this provision, that this body, the House of Representatives and the Senate, which passed the reauthorization 98-0, Democrats and Republicans, the contention is that this body exceeded its constitutional authority because Section 5 allegedly, according to the defenders of disenfranchisement, is no longer relevant. Now, in the aftermath of Barack Obama's historic election in 2008, there was a Supreme Court case involving Austin, Texas, I believe, in 2009, that was heard just a few months after his inauguration. And part of the argument that was made in that Supreme Court case by those who sought to invalidate Section 5's preclearance requirement was that as a result of this historic election of Barack Obama, race seems no longer to be an issue in America. And they pointed to the elevation of Barack Obama to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Now, of course, that was an extremely important moment in the history of our republic. It was a substantial step forward. But the reality is that the election of Barack Obama has also served to illustrate that in America there's still some issues of race that we've got to confront. It's interesting because if you look at the election of presidents since the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, it's unprecedented in the aftermath of President Obama's election to have seen the level of voter suppression laws and efforts that we were forced to confront in this country. These efforts presumably are based on the thin claim that those who are advancing these laws were trying to guard against fraud. No evidence of fraud, but those who are advancing these voter suppression laws attempting to guard against fraud. But when you look at the record, what's fascinating is that when Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, there was no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. He was reelected in 1972, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. And then Jimmy Carter's elected in 1976, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. And then Ronald Reagan's elected in 1980 and re-elected in 1984, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. George H.W. Bush, elected in 1988, no explosion of concern of alleged fraud. Bill Clinton, elected in 1992, re-elected in 1996, and no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. George W. Bush, elected, some would argue under questionable circumstances given the dynamics in the great state of Florida. But again, no explosion of concern related to alleged fraud. The same was true in 2004, notwithstanding some concerns in the great state of Ohio, no explosion of concern for alleged fraud. Yet, Barack Obama is elected in 2008. And all of a sudden, in the aftermath of this historic election, there's an outbreak of concern, a pandemic of anxiety as it relates to the fraud that allegedly is taking place in America. And so, as this chart illustrates, it is a wonderful chart that was prepared by the Brennan Center of Justice in my home state of New York, connected to my alma mater, New York University. It illustrates that since 2001, 41 states introduced 180 restrictive laws. Those states are illustrated by the red on the map, parenthetically a curious choice of colors, but those states are illustrated by the red on the map. 41 states introduced 180 restrictive laws. And then you have 34 states introduced photo identification requirements. 17 states introduced proof of citizenship requirements. 16 states introduced bills to limit registration, and 9 states introduced bills to limit or reduce early voting periods. Unprecedented in the history of our democracy. I just went through the election of several presidents who were inaugurated post the 1965 Voting Rights Act, but for some reason the American people are smart enough to draw cause and effect. When this president was elected, we had an outbreak of concern related to alleged fraud. Now, thankfully, the Voting Rights Act and Section 5 was in place to do something about it. I just talked about the fact that there were 41 states that introduced some form of voter restrictions. On this map, we see that as of October in 2012, there were 25 laws and 2 executive actions that were passed in a total of 19 states. A large amount of this activity, as you can see on this map, Mr. Speaker, took place in the Deep South and in Texas, states that are largely covered by the Section 5 preclearance requirements. Let me just pause parenthetically and note what's also interesting is there were 2 states, Iowa and Florida, that in the past had executed through executive order reforms designed to allow those who, as a result of the criminal justice system, had had their ability to vote taken away from them, restored through a process that had been put in place. But in the aftermath of the election of President Obama, what we saw is that in Iowa and in Florida, those 2 states, through executive order, repealed those positive steps forward to make it almost impossible for those who had brushes with the law to ever be able to re-engage in the ability to participate in American democracy. And so these were laws that were passed, although because of the Section 5 preclearance requirement, not all of these laws actually were able to take effect. And that's an important point as it relates to the continuing relevance of Section 5's preclearance requirement. Now, as of October in 2012, approximately 12 courts either halted or blunted, they pushed back some of those laws that states had attempted to enact. Perhaps the most relevant example of why Section 5 continues to be relevant, Mr. Speaker, is what took place in the Lone Star State, the great state of Texas, where the legislature passed what would have been the most restrictive voter identification law in the country. It would have prohibited potential voters from presenting student college identifications. They were deemed in this law as invalid. It would have prevented voters from presenting state government identification. IDs that were actually issued by the state of Texas would not have been valid under this law. I find it interesting, particularly in light of the current debate that we're having related to how we deal with gun violence in America, is that one of the forms of ID that actually would have been accepted was a license that allowed an individual to carry a concealed handgun permit. Now, this was too much for the Justice Department and those who, in good conscience, seek to defend our democracy to accept. And because Texas is a covered jurisdiction, it had to be presented for pre-clearance by the Department of Justice or a 3-judge panel, and it was rejected. And so this law, though passed, never took effect. The same thing happened in Alabama. The same thing happened in South Carolina. There's a law that was passed by the state of Florida that is under consideration, and so as a result, even though many objectively believe it was designed to suppress the vote, it did not take effect in advance of the 2012 election because it's under review by the Department of Justice and their pre-clearance requirement. Mr. Speaker, in America, certainly we have come a long way, but we still have a long, long way to go. Jim Crow may be dead, but he still got some nieces and nephews that are alive and well. And until every single descendant of Mr. Jim Crow are dead and buried, we at the Congressional Black Caucus believe that the Section 5 pre-clearance requirement of the Voting Rights Act remains as relevant today as it was when it was passed in 1965. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Representative Jeffries. Mr. Speaker, may I ask how much time we have remaining?
The gentleman has 13 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we have discussed this evening as the Congressional Black Caucus, voting rights are an issue that all Americans are entitled to. And we should be helping more voters participate in our democracy, not creating laws that prevent or discourage anyone from voting. And as my colleague, the co-anchor from New York, Mr. Jeffries, just explained, we have made tremendous progress in recent history in securing the right to vote for many minority communities. A fully free and democratic society is always a work in progress. And with each election, we are reminded that we cannot rest. We must always come to the defense of voting rights. And we cannot be caught off guard or pretend that because time has passed that we do not need to continue to fight to safeguard our rights. Now, no successful social justice movement has secured freedom absent vigilance. And that's why we're here tonight, to defend a pillar of justice and democracy. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was approved by Congress to protect fundamental voting rights and to protect minority groups from disenfranchisement. After a series of violent attacks on civil rights leaders who were registering African Americans to vote, former President Lyndon B. Johnson sent draft legislation to Congress to protect voting rights, and it was signed into law soon thereafter. Since then, the Voting Rights Act has been one of the nation's most effective civil rights laws and tools to combat discrimination in voting. Over time, the tactics used to stop people from voting have become more sophisticated. Unfair voter ID laws, barriers to voter registration, and narrowed early voting opportunities were all used in an attempt to suppress the vote in 2012. Overall, 2,400 changes in voting laws were stopped because of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, as my colleague, Mr. Jeffries, just outlined. In January, the NAACP president, Benjamin Jealous, said, "The nation has been facing some of the, quote, greatest attacks on voting rights since segregation, and that the potential to repeal Section 5 is the biggest threat yet." Whether it's attempts to restrict early voting in Ohio or Florida, or throwing up billboards in minority communities that read, "Voter fraud is a felony," we know that our work is not done. Intimidation is still a tactic employed by some seeking to scare voters from the polls. And until that threat is extinct, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act still has a very important role to play in making full democratic enfranchisement a reality in our society. But we secured the integrity of our electorate in 2012, and it's in part because of the Voting Rights Act. Now, this is not a partisan issue. In fact, there is bipartisan consensus on that point. In 2006, the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized with overwhelming support from both sides of the aisle. In fact, this body, the House of Representatives, has voted 4 times with strong bipartisan support every time to reauthorize Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Every reauthorization has been signed into law by a Republican president. The most recent reauthorization vote was 390 to 33 in the House and 98 to 0 in the Senate. As part of the last reauthorization, Congress released over 15,000 pages of committee reports that demonstrated large-scale evidence of voting discrimination. Not only did these findings lead to a bipartisan vote to reauthorize the legislation, but Congress also cited the invaluable role of Section 5 in thwarting racial injustice. According to the committee report, without the continuation of the Voting Rights Act's protections, the evidence is clear that, quote, racial and language minority citizens will be deprived of the opportunity to exercise their vote or will have their votes diluted. In other words, Mr. Speaker, the Voting Rights Act is important for many different communities. Now, the writing is on the wall. Our work is not done. Section 5 must be upheld, and because of that, we stand in strong support of the Voting Rights Act here tonight. I'd like to now bring my colleague, Mr. Jeffries, up so that we can highlight some of the provisions of the Voting Rights Act, both from a historical perspective, but most importantly, how it still applies today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Horsford, and I think that you hit on a very important point that should be reemphasized in the context of this debate. Every single reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, was signed into law by a Republican president. And so in 1970, the reauthorization was signed into law by President Richard Nixon. In 1975, it was President Gerald Ford. 1982, it was Ronald Reagan, and in 2006, it was George Bush. It was the current House majority, held in different form, but when Republicans were in charge of the chamber, who allowed the reauthorization to move forward through the Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan basis. Now, this may seem strange in the current poisonous environment of Washington that we exist in right now, but there was significant cooperation, tremendous leadership shown by the then chairperson and the ranking member, John Conyers. It passed in the House of Representatives 390 to 33. It's also interesting to note historically that prior to this year, every time Section 5 and the Voting Rights Act has been used to address alleged concerns with redistricting, which traditionally take place 2 years after the completion of the census, when it was used by the Justice Department to block or modify redistricting reforms or changes prior to the Obama administration, every other occasion since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, it was a Republican Justice Department charged with the responsibility of addressing concerns with redistricting and the problem of racial gerrymandering. It was the Nixon Justice Department in 1972. It was the Reagan Justice Department in 1982. It was the George H.W. Bush Justice Department in 1992. It was the George W. Bush Justice Department in 2002. And so the history of Section 5 and the Voting Rights Act is a glorious one, not just as it relates to the preservation of our democracy, addressing the need to make sure that every American, regardless of race or color, has the capacity to participate in a meaningful way, but it's been traditionally viewed and executed through a bipartisan lens. And we're hopeful that when the Supreme Court takes up oral argument on this matter in 2 days, that they will evaluate it on the merits and give due deference to Congress, which has consistently reauthorized it pursuant to its power under Article 1 of the Constitution, as well as the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America. There really is no case to be made that it should be declared invalid. I believe we've illustrated time after time how it's been used to protect the integrity of our democracy, and we're hopeful that at some point down the road it will no longer be necessary. But, Mr. Speaker, that moment has not arrived in America as of today. I yield back the balance of my time to Representative Horsford to close.
Thank you, Representative Jeffries. And as you just indicated, Wednesday's hearing before the Supreme Court is to hear arguments as it pertains to whether to preserve Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so that is why the Congressional Black Caucus has come to the floor this evening, is to bring attention to this very important provision of current law and to ensure that as the legislative branch that we have the ability to preserve and to strengthen the Voting Rights Act as necessary. And so we want to continue to push forward. You know, there are those who have come before, who have fought, bled, and died for our right to vote. and we want to continue to fight and preserve everyone's right to vote. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman have a motion?
Mr. Speaker, at this time, I move that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. for morning hour debate.
So the House has gavelled out, but members return on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Eastern for morning hour speeches and noon for legislative work. Later this week, work begins on a bill that reauthorizes the Violence Against Women Act. That measure's already passed in the Senate, and it now awaits House action. You can follow the House live here on C-SPAN when members return tomorrow.